different roles in his career, and he's been a consultant also at some point of time for all the consultants in the room. He's worked in investment banking and, illustrious career. And, he's been, conceptualizing and planning the entire post-pandemic recovery of the country. It's been like almost 34 months or something like that. Yeah, something like that. And country has done remarkably well during this time. We have experienced for third consecutive year on an average, I think more than 7%, and last year was 8.2%.
I think I have to stop you here. I don't think I should take credit for any of this. Probably the country did all of this in spite of me. So,
that's you being modest. Without wasting much time, let me jump into, the fireside chat. And how can I not start by mentioning one of the most anticipated global event that happened yesterday night, our night time, when Fed cut 50 basis point rate. It was almost like that Gabriel Garcia book, where their death foretold kind of a thing, where the whole world was waiting for that to happen. And Fed has cut 50 basis point, and it's expected that in next 24 months there will be series of cuts, and it has implications on the global economy. Apart from that, you would have seen that 10 days back the oil prices crashed, which is good news for India, but it also tells us that there is severe global headwind when it comes to growth. There is also dollar weakening. So all these parameters together, Dr. Nageswaran, how do you see the global economy panning out and its impact on the Indian growth story in FY25 and 26, at least the immediate future?
Oh, I think to answer this one question, we would probably need 260 minutes rather than 26 minutes that we have, because you have packed a lot into this one question, and there are too many moving parts, and it will be presumptuous on my part to try and see or talk about the net impact on the world economy. I think because the Fed rate cut is not the only thing that matters. We have geopolitical conflicts everywhere, and there is an all-important election that is coming up in the US in November. And in general, the global economy has been slowing. The trend growth has been coming down. If you look at the IMF's World Economic Outlook forecast, and it will be revised again in October, they predict a 2% steady state growth for the world for advanced economies in the coming years. Yes, the rate cut by the Federal Reserve was much awaited, but I mean, one can also discuss whether whether things should be that way, that the interest rate cut of 50 basis points should really be something that all of us should be hanging on to. So I think it will have different implications depending on how much of it's already been priced in. But I think much of it was priced in already.
Yes.
So in that sense, the interest rate curves have moved ahead of the Fed action. Yeah. The stock markets had moved ahead of the Fed action. In fact, as it turned out yesterday in the US markets, by the rumors, sell the fact kind of thing happened. The indices ended up on the red for the day. So I think it's very difficult, therefore, to say whether the rate cut per se would be a fillip to the global economy, because other things don't remain the same. Other things are not held constant. If everything else stays constant, then the rate cut by itself should be a positive, because it lowers the dollar cost of capital, increases dollar liquidity in the world, and many countries, developing countries that were affected by the tightening interest rates in the US between 2022 and 2023 will be relieved to see more dollar liquidity that happens. So from that perspective, it should be a positive. But as I said, to be able to come up with a sort of a net impact statement, one has to assess a lot of moving parts, and we don't have the time for it. But I think on balance, I would say it is positive for emerging economies. And for India, especially if you look at the stock market, because it is already attracting a lot of investor interest, and it has been so for the last several years, whether it is foreign or domestic or both, maybe at the margin the impact will be relatively limited because it is not something that that was waiting for this to happen. Investor interest for India was not waiting for this to happen. It's been there. So that is why the impact on India might be relatively more muted than in other places.
Yeah. But that also brings to the question that, finally the central bank throughout the world, they're getting comfortable with where the inflation is headed and, probably with commodity prices also cooling off. It's getting to that comfort zone. But one of the areas of interest for you, I've read it in your economic survey also, is impact of climate change on inflation. The weather patterns are changing and, huge difference in temperature, particularly in, tropical climate where temperature already is hovering in the high 20s. If there is a change in weather pattern, it is really impacting the crops, and that's really impacting inflation, which is probably the monetary policy cannot address. So you mentioned some of the measures like, the strengthening the coal supply chain and research in agriculture. So that's a policy matter. So, what do you think that, going forward for India, what will be the policy reaction to, I think this is going to be there in our lifetime. Every time, we need to have that climate resilience.
No, I think you're right. Climate change will naturally have a greater impact on the supply side of commodities particularly. So therefore, to that extent, and you're also right to point out that monetary policy per se will have limited role to play in managing that. It's about boosting productivity. It is about heat-resistant crops and seeds. That is why the government in August released new varieties of heat-resistant, weather-resistant seeds. And historically, we have also noticed that agricultural research and development has had a much higher multiplier effect on yields. And I think today we hear that the Honorable Home Minister will be launching White Revolution 2.0. So I think it's important that we also, when we think of agriculture, we think of agriculture and allied activities. Because in the last 10 years or so, apart from cereals, which is what we tend to focus on, rice, wheat, and then maybe cotton and sugarcane, growth rates in poultry, in dairy and fisheries and horticulture, etc., they have grown at double the rate of the standard agriculture, the staple crops. And if you add food processing and cold storage chains, etc., the growth rate of agriculture and allied activities can still be make a significant contribution to growth. And climate change need not come in the way if we are adapting to it, and we are adapting to it. The more important thing is, apart from this R&D activities, and as you mentioned, heat-resistant crops, we also need to work on land consolidation. Because the average size of a holding in India used to be 2.8 hectares in 1970s. It has come down to 1 hectare, and we wrote about it in the economic survey. So over 50 years, the average holding has fallen quite a lot, and an economic size for farming to be economically viable is at least 4 hectares. So we need work in multiple areas for us to be able to handle the impact of climate and continue to have agriculture as an engine of growth. Because there is a standard assumption that as the countries progress, we will have to look up to industry and services for growth. But in a world where technology is changing rapidly and could displace labor in some areas, and you have the huge competition coming from China with respect to manufacturing, we actually cannot relegate agriculture as an industry of the past. It can be an activity for the future as well. And we can therefore take climate change in our stride if we continue to invest in R&D and also take other measures which will boost farm sector productivity.
Absolutely. But that leads also to the point of another very important aspect that contributes to the economy's exports, the trade. And although I think a very ambitious target of $2 trillion exports, 1 trillion services, 1 trillion goods and services together, 2 trillion. I think there is some immediate headwind when it comes to global trade. And we've seen that, I think yesterday the trade deficit data also came out. So probably in the medium term, sectors such as electronics, textile, we are seeing some really big boost to that, and those are the labor-intensive sectors. But that's also linked to our job issue. I mean, whether we can create more export-oriented, job-focused economy. So for the immediate future, next 2 years, given the global headwind, what are you seeing in the external sector?
Look, I mean, whether it is next 2 years or next 5 years, I think first of all, having an ambitious target is not a bad thing. We should have ambitious targets because that gives us some sort of a momentum, impetus, motivation to strive harder. But whether we get there or not depends on multiple factors, many of them beyond our control. That doesn't make the target any less important. It has to be consequential. It has to be ambitious. But nonetheless, the reality is that there are formidable challenges to boosting the trade share of growth, export share of growth, because in the first decade, when Indian exports contributed a lot to GDP growth, of the order of magnitude of 1 to 1.5 percentage points every year between 2003 and 2008, when the economy grew at 8 to 9% per annum, the global economy was booming. But if you look at the forecast for global economy, as we discussed earlier, it is tepid. And global trade volume growth has been declining on a trend basis. And more importantly, trade restrictions, tariff and non-tariff, have proliferated post-2020 as well. They have gone up by orders of magnitude. And countries are now pursuing active industrial policy. So we need to be cognizant of all of these things and not to leave out things like the carbon border adjustment tax, EU deforestation rules, etc., all of which are actually barriers in multiple forms, disguised, not so well disguised, etc. So given these, we feel that much of the growth for India will come from domestic demand sources. External demand will be the icing on the cake. And for example, in 21-22, net exports contributed a big way to India's GDP growth of 9.7% in FY 21-22. There could be such opportunistic years in which we can advance the export share of GDP. But by and large, on a trend basis, on an ongoing basis, exports will be doubly harder for various reasons we just now discussed. That's why all the more reason we need to continue to work on chipping away at our obstacles that still stand in the way in terms of last mile costs, logistics, formalities, and R&D in the private sector, in which India really lags behind. And as we were discussing before we came into this hall on expanding the scope, reach, and our influence of the global capability centers, etc. So I think the mobile phones PLI is a success story with respect to exports. So we need to look at some of the success ingredients of that sector and see if we can replicate it elsewhere. But it's going to be a hard grind. We should be prepared for that. And there could be opportunistic years in which we leap into the next higher zone, as we did in 21-22. Until then, for example, our merchandise exports were about $250 to $300 billion. In 21-22, it leapt to $420 billion. Now we're talking about 450, 460. And then there could be 1 year in which we leap to $550, $600 billion. That is the way to take it forward while we work on the nuts and bolts. I think it's important at this point to stress to the audience as well. The economic survey, that's why I focus on the fact that the growth prospect for India going forward is going to be based on nuts and bolts and the plumbing of economic reform. This is not going to happen based on the front page reforms. That is by and large harvested. We need to look at the details, and that is where the action is.
And many of these sectors which are like of focus of the government, Honorable Prime Minister mentioned about $500 billion worth of electronics export, and then there is a textile program. And these will also probably have more women participation. So the labor force women participation, and these are typical sectors where there will be more. That also brings into your point of gender equality and participation in the labor force.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, skilling and enhancing the labor force participation are also part of this ingredient, whether it is exports or manufacturing, etc. And I think some of you may have come across a video that is floating around on social media, a 50-second clip of Mr. Tim Cook talking about the extent of skilled labor available in China. And he says the attractiveness of China doesn't lie in low-cost manufacturing anymore, but in the fact that you get skilled labor on scale, on steroids almost, in terms of the number of people you can access, you can tap at any given point in time. And there we still have a long way to go to catch up, but the good news is that it is still an area where we can improve, in which case we will have results to show for it. Yeah. And in terms of skilling, 10 years ago when we had CII together with VBox launch the National Employability Test, only 1/3 of the college graduates who took the test passed the exam, but now it is 51%, 52%. So there is a substantive improvement, but equally you can say that 48% still are not passing the test, which means you have room to grow. So many of these challenges actually can end up being your stepping stones if we address those issues, and we are addressing those issues. That is why the budget this time focused a lot on enhancing labor force participation, on skilling, on internship opportunities, on vocational training, etc. We just need to do them on scale.
Yeah. So one of the areas, as you passingly mentioned, of what we are discussing just before coming onto the stage, is the GCC, the Global Capability Center, and overall services exports. I mean, it was earlier only information IT, ITES services, but the kind of management services, accounting services, R&D services. So it's, I mean, there are 1,600 GCCs in India and almost, 1/3 of the Fortune 500 company. This is one area where probably a lot more can be done. And I think the effort, if government brings in with adequate policies to move into now tier 2, tier 3 cities, where probably the employment generation and that skilling gap could be much, quicker to plug that in.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's hard to quarrel with that statement. I think much of the growth will necessarily come from tier 2 and tier 3 cities, and the potential for them to catch up with the rest of the metros. It's also about economic convergence. I think wherever there are wrinkles in the policy space, and it is not only policy that needs to sort of step up to the plate to make this happen. I think there is a need for industry, academia collaboration to make sure that the skill gaps are addressed. Policy can look at issues like taxation or certainty for investors going forward. Those definitely are important. At the same time, when it comes to skilling, it's very important that it is not a responsibility that is only that of the government, but also that of the private sector. Both industry and academia have to collaborate together. And I think that is much more potential out there.
Yeah. For example, we hired non-engineering graduates, 60 of them from Tripura, and trained them in basic cyber knowledge and absorbed most of them in our Bhubaneswar office. So, it's a great story of Heartland, hiring non-technical kids from Northeast and placing them in a tier 2 city like Bhubaneswar.
Very, very gratifying to hear that,
Yeah. No, so those things can be at scale also, like
absolutely.
Testing.
It has to be on scale.
On scale, yeah. So that brings me to very interesting and most anticipated, the elephant in the room kind of a thing for the economy is the private investment. I mean, one thing is that the rural spending is seeing signs of green shoots, but we still, I think, government has been holding up the burden of holding up the investment, and really economy has been chugging with that. But I think, when do you think, private sector will finally join the party? Because all of us, that's most anticipated thing for the Indian economy, at least.
No, I think your question is a behavioral insight. No matter what evidence we write about, the stickiness of the prayer is very difficult to displace. The stickiness of the belief that private sector is yet to join the investment party refuses to go away, and evidence doesn't seem to matter.
Okay.
That shows the power of anecdotes over evidence, and that is human nature. Okay, but the truth is the private sector has joined the investment party. It is not a aircraft that is waiting to take off. It has taken off. And more recently, and if you look at the national income data, which gives you the granular breakdown of private sector capital formation, we have data only up to FY23. FY24 data will come only in January. You could see that India's gross fixed capital formation went up from 27% to 30.8%, a 3.5 percentage point increase, and not all of it came from public sector capex spending. Okay, so yes, there was a slight drop or decline in private sector in FY20 and FY21. Those were difficult years. One was the year of NBFC crisis and one was the pandemic year. But subsequently, there has been a recovery. And more recently, in the August monthly bulletin of Reserve Bank of India, you see the fund mobilization done by companies on a bottom-up aggregation basis. And it is at a 12-year high. And it is for capital investment purposes. So, as you see with the government's capex already having gone up substantially in the last 4 to 5 years, even with further increment, the growth rate will naturally be lower because the base is higher. And you will see the private sector coming in. And it is actually a story that's already unfolding. And if it is unfolding at a rate that is slower than what it was, let's say, between 2003 and 8, it's all the better. We would rather have it slower and stronger for longer rather than swifter and shorter.
Yeah, and so that their balance sheets are stressed, banks' balance sheets are stressed.
Absolutely. And I think if we don't see, therefore, private sector coming to the markets and raising money, we should not forget that private sector's corporate profitability went up by 4x. If you look at a sample of 30,000 companies that CMIE tracks from FY20 to FY23, corporate profits, including the financial sector, went up from 5.3 trillion rupees to 20.6 trillion rupees. Excluding the financial sector, it went up from 4.1 trillion rupees to 13.9 trillion rupees. These are huge increases in a space of 3 years. So the private sector has ample internal resources, and they are deploying it. So capital formation is happening in the private sector.
Yeah, but I mean, I think in the budget also it was acknowledged, I think in the economic survey also it was acknowledged that it's very difficult given the global scenario on FDI. Because, even if, the whole story that the China +1, but, you seeing that what Mexico is attracting, what Poland is, attracting, a lot of near-shoring, friendly shoring happening. So what's the thinking in government in terms of the foreign direct investment?
No, I'm glad you asked this question as well, because recently a young colleague of mine and I actually wrote an article for the print online, print.in. First of all, gross FDI inflows into India in FY24 were no different from it was in FY23.
Yeah.
Okay, around $70 billion. Yeah. No change. What made the net numbers look lower was good exits. So India actually provided good exits.
Yeah.
In a buoyant capital market allowed direct investors actually to cash in on their profits. And the investment changed hands from direct to portfolio investors. Yeah. And that actually is a very important ingredient of attracting investments. You should give investors viable exits. And we did that. And that is the reason why, if you look at investment intentions, India figures in the top 5, notwithstanding near-shoring, friend-shoring, on-shoring, etc., India still stands very high. I mean, recently, for example, an independent research group called the Rhodium Group put out a list of countries who could potentially, in the medium to long run, be viable alternatives to China. And India figures in the top 5, given its own scale and size and the numbers of people who can be deployed, who can be skilled and deployed. So I think we are running a marathon. We are not running a short sprint here. And government is, and last 3-4 years, we opened up defense sector, we opened up drones, etc., space exploration. All these sectors were opened up for foreign direct investment. And the government will continue to address whatever issues that are there to make sure that FDI is an important component of financing our current account deficit.
Yeah. Now, coming to one of the favorite subjects, I think you mentioned in your opening remark also about the plumbing part of the economy and what will take us to the next level of growth, and it may not be the headline kind of screaming reforms, but those kind of things. So I think globally, most of the economists and analysts who are tracking India, they all agree that what India has achieved in last few years in terms of a macro stability is remarkable. But still, everybody says that at micro level, doing business is still not that easy. So, is that ease of doing business or plumbing, whatever you call it. So, there will be a significant amount of effort that will be needed to improve that image of India still being a difficult place to do business.
Look, I think we need to be very clear about one thing. even as India addresses problems, legacy problems, aspirations also keep shifting. Expectations also keep shifting. Therefore, that should not obscure the fact that progress has been achieved in multiple areas. And that is why we have come from $300 billion in 1993 to $3.6 trillion in FY24. And that has been achieved on a much lower debt accumulation. So per dollar of debt, India's GDP performance is much better than many other countries, comparable countries. Okay, so therefore the fact that we still have areas to address should not obscure the fact that much has been done as well. But what I mean by the plumbing is that where the action has to be is now with respect to deregulation that predominantly constrains small and medium enterprises. Large enterprises work around some of these things. They can find workarounds. They can outsource compliances. But for small and medium enterprises, which are an important backbone of any manufacturing economy, they have a limited bandwidth and much of it is expended in meeting compliance requirements or avoiding them. And I think that needs to change. And then there the action has to shift to state governments, whether it is land use, building use guidelines, labor market regulations. I mean, for example, the economic survey mentions the number of areas in which women are prohibited from working totals 140 number of restrictions if you aggregate them across states. And then we talk about, therefore, low female labor force participation rate. Of course, much more important than that for female labor force participation to go up is to ensure safety on the streets, safety in the workplace, law and order, child care facilities. But beyond that, legally and regulatory architecture also places restrictions. And building use code, the number of car parking space that India mandates, and the floor space index being low. All these things lower the amount of land available for actual building a factory, so much so that per unit cost of production is much higher in India. So these are all examples of areas where we actually have much more room to improve, and actually, therefore, that is the bright side of things. Instead of seeing it as glass half empty, I see it as glass half full. And if we address those issues, then growth can actually, even without export growth, even without foreign demand picking up, we could move from a potential growth rate of 6.5% more sustainably to between 7 and 7.5.
Yeah. My last question, I think we will wrap up. You have a hard stop. I think in a recent interview which I heard of yours, is you said that India could be the agenda setter for the global south. I think the context was of that speech was the financialization and how access to bank accounts and other things, but also the entire India stack, taking it to other countries. So how do you see India taking its role seriously as a leader for the global south?
Well,
coming from your G20 declaration and stuff
obviously, as you saw in the G20, India has taken the lead in not only articulating the concerns and priorities of developing countries in international forum, but also we have been open to sharing our own experiences, technology, etc., with global south countries, whether it is with respect to the digital payment architecture, whether it is with respect to giving a voice to their own concerns and aspirations in climate negotiations, and now also with respect to how we handle the evolution of the financial sector in this country over the next 20-30 years, will also be a natural template and role model for other countries to look at. Because if you look at, for example, the United States, bulk of the funding comes from capital markets. Yeah. If you look at China, for example, bulk of the funding comes from the banking system. If you look at India, the funding is very nicely balanced between capital markets and the banking system. And I think we should maintain that balance, because over-dependence on one horse or the other will lead to imbalances, and that is what will eventually lead to financialization or dominance of public policy by financial interests. That is what is meant by financialization. So I think we have done, by and large, very well with our calibrated approach to capital account convertibility, with respect to opening up for capital flows, etc. And these are all will naturally become templates or inspiration for other countries to follow.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think we are already running out of time, and you have a hard stop. You are to rush back. I wish we had more time. I could have gone on for, another 30 minutes at least, and I'm not able to open up for questions for the audience. I'm sorry about that. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. It was a fantastic session. Thank you for sharing your positive outlook on India's growth with all of us. Rather, how we should be focusing on having a slower but a stronger growth, not but a shifter and a swifter and a very temporary growth. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. So, Devashish, may I humbly request you to kindly present the certificate of Sankalp Taru to our respected Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, Mr. Nageswaran. Thank you so much, sir, once again for joining us here today. This is a token of gratitude. And in the spirit of sustainability, we have planted a tree in your name. Kindly accept the certificate for the same. Thank you so much. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I believe we can have a big round of applause for Mr. Nageswaran. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Debashish. Thank you, sir. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, we are now moving forward to a very inspiring session, because I am going to invite on stage an inspiring change maker who has completely revolutionized the digital identity program and the digital payment system in India. Yes, I'm talking about none other than the former chief architect of Aadhaar, India's digital identity program, which has successfully